So this talk is called Styling React Applications in 2020, Understanding Theme UI, the latest evolution of CSS in JavaScript. So this talk is about styling, broadly speaking, but more specifically, it's about this new styling library that was released in June of this past year, 2019. And I want to talk about this because I feel like it really is the direction that CSS is moving, and it's going to be kind of the direction of the future. So I want to talk about how we got there and why I think it's really the direction of the future for styling pretty much everything, but specifically more complex applications. A little bit about me. I am a full stack developer. I'm focused pretty much on the front end. I know I can be dangerous with Node and stuff, but mostly focused on styling and design. I've worked on 3 different design tools over the last 5 years. So styling is kind of like my thing. It's my primary, it's something that I'm most interested in. I mean, I don't know if I can call myself a design systems engineer, but it's on my blog. It's like one of my things, like, well, who am I? I'm a design systems engineer. So that's me. So yeah, so let's talk about web styling. It's in a weird place right now. The thing is, CSS was basically the same since it was created. I mean, there's been iterations, there's been features added, there's been different pre and post processors that have come out. You've got Sass, Less, Stylus, all these different things that help with writing CSS, but these have all been syntactic sugar changes. They're things that change the syntax of CSS, but not the underlying way it works. So CSS, mostly the same for about 10 years. Over those 10 years, though, the web got a lot more complicated. I mean, apps kind of started being a thing, right? We had mostly documents like personal blogs and directories that were the main thing on the web for a long time. But now we have applications, we have logic, we have people are using this to build tools that are used by people instead of desktop apps. So there's a lot more that has come along with that, many more requirements. We've got to incorporate a lot more logic, and we have just bigger and more complex states for our applications to be in. So that being the case, we have a kind of a paradigm shift where global styling, which used to be the default for styling web documents, is no longer the default because we don't want to change the header and the body and all of the images of a document at the same time anymore. That made sense when all you had was a post and like 10 posts on your page and that was your website, or when you had few features and you wanted to be able to change everything all at once. That's no longer the case. I mean, things are just so complex. So something had to give, and something gave. There's been, I say there was about 10 years that CSS hadn't changed, but around 5 years ago, we had reached a critical point. There was a lot of groundswell around fixing CSS. And a lot of this was driven by Facebook with their React library. So React had, at the time that Facebook was using it, they had hundreds of developers who were not necessarily front-end developers that were writing front-end logic, writing components, styling things with CSS. And they ended up running into all sorts of problems with this just because of how complex those demands were and how many people they had working on things at the same time. So eventually they had put somebody on the problem, and the person they put on the problem was Christopher Shadow. You might or might not know him from the Create React app framework. You might know him from Prettier, which is a styling tool that's just absolutely all the rage. Pretty much everywhere these days. I mean, I don't know if you go to a company and they're not using Prettier, it's like, what's wrong with you? But anyway, so he introduced this idea of CSS in JavaScript. So JavaScript right now drives all of React and drives a lot of like creating the elements that are on the screen, right? But it doesn't hold much styling logic because up until this point, it created HTML. As we know, HTML is about content, it's not about styling. So the idea of putting CSS styles inside of your JavaScript was pretty revolutionary. It was like, why are you doing this? Why do you think this is a good idea? You're a terrible person. But then he put out a slide, and it became apparent that he wasn't a terrible person because there were these problems. I'm not going to go through them all right here, but this is actually a slide from his talk where he introduced this idea, and he was talking about there's these 7 huge problems that they were seeing at Facebook, and number one problem is the global namespace. So In CSS, in plain vanilla, unspecial CSS, if you declare a style, it's associated usually with like a class or an ID or a selector to reference an HTML element. The problem is at a global scale, if you define a variable at the top level, that's going to affect every single other um, element that it references in the application. So when you get to the scale of Facebook, you've got a lot of global namespace clashes, where one developer names something and doesn't see that it's actually overriding the styles that another developer assigned to that same class or ID or selector. And we've got all these other problems, and he gets into that in that talk, and there's actually a link in the slides if you want to grab it. But suffice to say, that was the one of them. That was maybe the biggest one. But there are many other huge issues with CSS as it stands. So that kind of, when he released that talk, there was this explosion. People took what he was talking about, CSS in JavaScript, and just went hog wild. I mean, we have, I don't know how many are here, probably at least 100 different libraries. And these are not like little libraries. Some of them have hundreds, some of them have thousands of stars and users. And so there was just a huge wave of interest that came out of that one talk and that one thing. So we're really looking at an evolution of styling of CSS. And why did it only happen when he suggested it? Well, it's because there's really only two places you can change the behavior of styling in an application. For a long time, CSS, and it still is, governed by the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, which is the kind of the people who decide what's in CSS. And then the browsers, all the different browsers, Chrome, Firefox, Opera, well, maybe not Opera, Safari, they have to decide whether or not they're going to implement the standards that are come up with from W3C. And if they are going to implement them, then it takes some time to actually get those standards across all the different browsers so you can start using the new features. So that's obviously big, slow to move. There's not going to be that much development there for kind of the high-speed iteration you need to fix a problem like this. So over the past 5 years, developers took things really into their own hands. There's these tools that have emerged. There's Webpack, there's Grunt, there's Rollup, there's all these different tooling libraries and a ton more sophistication around the way CSS is compiled, right, and brought into your application and bundled up to be served efficiently. And people, once they realized that they could just stick their CSS in their JavaScript and it wouldn't, it's not like a horrible, awful, terrible thing. Well, I mean, it wasn't the best thing when it started, but it's gotten a lot more sophisticated as time has gone by. Once they realized that, there was that huge explosion of libraries you saw. And out of that, kind of two main directions emerged. They kind of just coalesced into two styles. And it's these style objects and template strings. And there was kind of a war about who's going to win. And it's not necessarily a conclusive war because they each have different pros and cons. And I'm going to dive into that a little bit here. I'm going to keep it kind of brief. I'm not necessarily going to get into all the details, but there's some definite pros and cons we can call out. So this is what the inline style or style object looks like. You define all of your CSS properties directly in JavaScript in JSON objects. JSON, not necessarily JSON, it's not true JSON, but in that object notation, right? And the advantage of this is it's really easy to pass all your styles in as an object, which it's super quick to change something, to add something, to remove something, and your styles are directly related to the content that they are styling, the structure that they're styling, and that makes it easy also to write custom logic because it's all right there and it's just JavaScript. So if you need to execute some sort of logical expression, a greater than, a less than, checking whether or not a variable is equal to true or false, it's just JavaScript. So it's super easy as opposed to writing it in CSS where that becomes much more complicated. But the cons of this are significant. The cons of this are, number one, it's really hard to be consistent when you have inline styles, right? Because you're just declaring each value right there. Now, if I had color, maybe I wanted to have my text color in this div, right? And it's declared right there. Let's say maybe instead of max width 350, it was color red, right? Or maybe it's color like slightly darker red than normal, right? How are you going to get that value everywhere else across your application? Nobody's going to copy and paste that accurately over time and time again, especially when you have hundreds of developers that all need to use a red. Like, how are they going to all use the right red? So that's one issue. Performance is another one. When you're writing all these styles, you're directly assigning them to elements in the document object model, the DOM, which kind of defeats the purpose of putting them all in one place because you're assigning them to HTML elements, which is expensive and slow. You also lose some of the advantages of native CSS. So it's very much a trade-off. You don't get pseudo selectors, which allow you to easily reference different elements or different states of elements. And you also, it becomes a lot more difficult to do some of the things that CSS has evolved to do, some of the good things that we want to keep. So, ultimately, this is better for one-off quick styling changes. It's not great for styling whole applications. It's not a complete solution. The other solution that showed up was template strings. It's good. Template strings are great. They let you write CSS directly in JavaScript. So if you're familiar with the CSS syntax, you see here that what we have is literally normal CSS as it's written in a CSS file, but it's directly in the React. It's living in JavaScript. And what this ends up doing is actually the library. This is actually from a library called Styled Components. The library will take these styles that you declare and it'll stuff them all inside a style sheet, which is then inserted into the DOM at runtime. And this means that you're not applying styles directly to individual elements. You're not adding stuff directly to the DOM. It's all gets stuffed into a big sheet, and that sheet can be dynamically updated. But it means it's a lot more performant. It also means we can take advantage of native CSS features like pseudo selectors, and we'll come back to those in a little bit if you're wondering what those are. So that's obviously going to be more performant. It's going to be get that native flexibility, but it still doesn't have anything to really keep the consistency. So that's still an issue with this kind of approach. There's a lot more boilerplate. The styles are now kind of separated from the content, and because you're now writing CSS, using logic to determine your styles gets more complicated and it involves more code.
Quick question on that slide.
Yeah.
So you've got your constant box. You've got what looks to me like an element box.
Yeah.
Does that basically create a new element type?
Yeah, essentially that's what that's doing, exactly. So this is an example of a library called Styled Components, although there's a library called Emotion, which is also very similar API. But what it does is it says, okay, let's create a new div with these styles and let's assign it to this variable. So it's a box with those styles baked in. So yeah, so yes, to answer your question, it does do that. So, there's pros and cons to each of these approaches, right? With using objects, it's way easier to do logic. It's way easier to think about things. The styles are a lot closer to the actual structure of your page and the HTML. But the trade-offs are what we said earlier. We already went over those. And then you get the pros of template strings as well. So, this was the situation. This was the state maybe 2 years ago or so. The developer of Theme UI, who's a great guy, Brent Jackson, thought, why don't we have both? Why don't we see if there's a way to take advantage of both the native flexibility and performance and capabilities of template strings, and also the logical flexibility and the speed of use and ease of use of these objects. So he gave us Theme UI, which does that. So what exactly is Theme UI? Well, it's a mini framework because it pulls together a few different technologies and ideas to make this possible. If you look on the website, you go to that link, which I'm going to share the slides through the group so you can actually view that link. It lets you build themable design systems based on constraint-based design principles, which is a mouthful. But basically, it combines style objects and template strings, gives you the best of both worlds, the worst of neither, actually. The way he ended up doing it's smart. And it's not designed for document styling, right? It's not just more of the same, but looks a little different, tastes a little different. It's a new paradigm that's really incorporates, again, template strings, incorporates object styles, and it gets away from this whole document styling thing, this whole idea that the web is a static document. And this is really, that part's not necessarily breakthrough, but the way that he combined style templates or template strings and styling objects is pretty awesome. And there's some other libraries that do it, but none of them do it as well as this one. So We've been over this. We can just move on from this slide. Um, what does this actually look like? I'm going to just quickly run through some examples so you can get a feel for how it operates in practice. So number one thing is the theme object, and this solves those issues of consistency that I was talking about earlier on. When you have hundreds of developers, how do you make sure they're all using the same values, the same colors, the same spacing, right? Paddings and margins. How do you make sure everything stays consistent across all these different people committing code? It's the idea of a theme object that really solves this, because you list all of the values that you're allowed to use in your CSS in this object, and then all styling code in theme UI from the future pulls from these assigned values, which means that there's a lot less possibility for conflicting or values that are close but not the same, right? It's either here, in this example, we have four colors. We have text, we have your background color, your primary color, and your secondary color. And these are the only colors that will be present in your application. Because, well, as we'll see, the theme UI styling system only will use these values. Well, technically, you can use bare values as well, but that's you can also enforce against that. You also get your pseudo selectors. So what that looks like is, if you want to, here's an example of a form with an input. You can declare a style for when the input is focused, and you can do that right in line with where the element is initially declared. So you don't have to create a separate variable. You don't have to do any sort of state checking like you would have to do with template strings, or sorry, with styled objects. You just say, and when it's focused, I want it to have these styles, and when it's not focused, I want it to have this style right here. Man, I need a laser pointer. So you get those pseudo selectors, and again, all the other flexibility and capability of native CSS. And another thing that this provides that none of the other solutions before it provided is this whole concept of native mobile first responsive styling that's baked into how you define your styles right from the very beginning. So it has this ingenious idea where, you have for responsive styles, you need to define styles for all of the different screen sizes you want to accommodate. So you might have your phone styles. You want it to be this width on a phone. You want it to be slightly wider on a tablet, right? Maybe a slightly bigger font size on a tablet. And then what the heck do you want to look like on desktop? You got to decide that too. So with theme UI, you can simply provide all those different values. You can enumerate them in an array and say, I want my paddings, my possible paddings to be 3 and 4. And what does that mean, right? So 3 and 4, going back to our theme, we go to this space thing. So padding and margin pull from this space array, which says as a 0 indexed array, that means space 3 is 0, 1, 2, 3. We know that's going to be 16, which is translated by the system into 16 pixels. Okay, so a spacing of 3 is 16 pixels, a spacing of 4, 32 pixels. So with responsive styling, all you have to do is specify the indexes of the values that you want to use for each of the breakpoints. Breakpoints are when it decides to shift to the next one. Since it's mobile first, that means we know the first value in this array is the smallest breakpoint style. That means on phones, we're going to have that 3 padding value, which translates to 16 pixels. And then for anything bigger than that, the next value up is going to be 32 pixels. And this is just brilliant because up until now, if you've ever looked at responsive styling, it's a headache and it does not look as easy as this, let me tell you. And I've written it, and this is just so much easier.
With this, if I
Yeah, no, go ahead.
um, one of the toughest things I see here is I say 3, 4, and I'm going back and forth. Okay, which
Mm-hmm.
one's the third one, which is the fourth one? You have tooling that basically even tooltips you and says, oh, the third
Mm,
one is. So if I come and look at this, the third one is 16. The fourth one, of course, I can guess because I know 3 now.
yeah,
You know, that shows it at what you
yeah.
need, basically.
I don't know if anything exists like that yet, but if something doesn't, it would be worth building. It's something I might even look into building in the future. I think what tends to happen is after you work with these values for a little while, you just really just which one is which. Like I want it to be, but you use you three. If you use three times, you put the number three times. Like okay, it's this font size. I just want it to be that font size. You stop associating it with the actual CSS values, and you start associating it with what it needs to be, right? Which is a much more direct mapping, and that's really one of the most powerful advantages of this system is you're now thinking not in terms of values, you're thinking at a more direct mapping of I need my text to be, I need my it needs to be this, it needs to be a 3, right? Or it needs to be a 4. Which just it just simplifies it, reduces the amount of decisions that you have to make, um, and it lets you write things much more quickly as a result. Responsive logic as well. Now, these responsive values we're seeing in an array, right? But and that was for the styling, but the library also exposes some hooks to allow you to access the responsive values super easily as well. You just use responsive value and it'll spit out the correct value for the width of the screen that you are currently on. And that'll update as you resize the window. It'll update based on any other changes. So if you need to do some JavaScript logic around getting around which value to use, let's say you're trying to decide whether or not to use a sandwich little component, right, or a full header, which would be the case if you're trying to, deciding whether or not to render for mobile or for desktop. You can very easily just grab that value out of this array or out of this hook. It'll just output the correct element to use, and then you can just use it later on. It's just so much better. They also give you some extendable base components to let you get off the ground quickly. We have these are kind of like extensions of the React, or sorry, the native HTML elements. We have boxes, heading, text, and there's a bunch of other ones that just slurp in these values from the theme right away. So you can just slap in a heading and say variant H1, and it'll automatically get the correct font style, font height, text height, or whatever, and apply those directly right there. Very convenient. Another thing that you can do, and if you've ever worked with styled components or emotion or any of these other template string libraries, one of the things they let you do is create reusable components. Like we saw earlier, I had declared a box and I could just use it in multiple places and that would have all the same styling still associated with it. What we would want to do with this library to achieve that same functionality is simply define a new component and accept any particular styles for that component as props, and then we can pass them into this object. The little SX object here, by the way, this is what theme UI uses instead of the styles property. So you define an SX property, and all the values in there are processed by that library and return the correct result. If it's a number, it gets the correct value out of that array of values and does all the responsive handling as well. You can create variants. You can just say, for my text, I want these set of styles grouped together, and I want to be able to access them. So, going forward here, again, that example of the H1, I want this to be variant text heading, and it'll just go grab all the styles that are in this text heading thing here. This is one of the APIs that still needs a little thought. It's not completely thought through yet, and it's not necessarily the best way to do it, but it's what exists right now, and it does help, and it is convenient. But there is some room to iterate and improve. So that's kind of the gist of what it looks like. And if you kind of dozed off or whatever, it's totally fine. I had prepared this for a larger audience, and normally there's at least somebody that's not paying attention. You guys are being great, so I appreciate it. So the summary again, what does theme UI give us? It gives us this better style object property that will automatically grab values from our theme. It gives us the native CSS. It's funny to use native and CSS in the same sentence, by the way, but there it is. It gives us CSS capabilities like pseudo selectors. It gives us all this really easy responsive styling, gives us these media query hooks. And because this library theme UI actually sits on top of and abstracts libraries like styled components and emotion, we get the generated style sheets, right? We get those style sheets generated and stuffed into the DOM for free. You're not applying styles directly to your elements. You're applying them and they get generated into a style sheet. And what the library does is it'll actually come up with a class name for a unique, completely unique random class name for each of your components. And it'll reference the style sheet with that class name. So there's no possibility of global name crashes because all the class names, IDs, all those selectors, they're generated to be completely unique. you get those base components. And then again, because of all these things that it does, it means that working with theme UI is consistent. It's really fast. It's easy to pick up once you internalize, the very, very different values. Once you internalize them a little bit, it's easy to pick up, and it's really, really flexible. So why, again, is this important? Going back to what I was talking about initially, the web is evolving. We're not styling documents anymore. We're styling applications. So we can't use global styles, right? Logic, much more important because there's so many more things that can happen. Design systems, as a result of this, are becoming crucial. Design systems are that whole theme object idea, right? You can have your design team come up with a bunch of values, stuff them in that theme object, and then your developers will only use those values instantly, completely consistent across all of your applications. And design systems, because that value is just JSON, it's just a plain object, you can share that to your your iPhone code, your Android code, your native, whatever, it's Objective C, if it's Java, you can access that design system from anywhere once you build a little bit of tooling to move that data around. But it's just pure data, it's JSON, so it can go anywhere. So with all these things, with design systems, styling solutions need to keep up, and theme UI is the what that keeping up looks like. It's what that keeping up looks like. So what's next? I mentioned there's some things that we still have to work out with theme UI. Brent Jackson wrote this great post on what is still missing and what could be improved. One of those things is variance, and I could dive more deeply into why that's not necessarily the best solution. Variance. The gist of it is that it creates global variables again, which is why we created all this stuff to get away from, because global isn't the answer. There's still more thought needed, but we've come a long way. So if you guys, next time you build an application, instead of reaching for plain CSS or even something like style components, I would say grab, at least take a look at theme UI, think about using it, think about how you can integrate it. And if you come up with issues, contribute to the discussions. There's a GitHub, there's Twitter. Brent's great. He just responded to me today, actually. I had some questions. I had tweeted him and he came back and responded. There's people using it. I mean, like if we go and look at his tweet, he put out a tweet a few days ago. We can see there's people using it, and there I am at the top. This is my Twitter account, of course, but there's lots of other people. Remember Adam? This guy Adam's great. I actually met him in London as well when I was working at Marvel App. But there's people building lots of things with this. Scrolling down the wrong feed with this, and here's different examples. Primer.style, so GitHub, right? GitHub, the central code repository online, they are using this guy's code. They're using this library theme UI for some of their work. There's people using it. It's still new. It came out in June, right? So there's lots more, but I mean, we just need more people looking at this. So take a look at it and get involved in the community for sure. And that's really all I have. If you have questions or comments or whatever, happy to answer.